Hello, Culture Matters podcast. I'm so excited to introduce you to our guest. Before I do that, here's a quote just for this podcast. Show me the incentive, and I will show you the outcome. Charlie Munger, Charles T. Munger, our guest today, is a great friend of the Culture Matters podcast, although I've met them only recently. The person that's actually put them in my life is someone I'd love to acknowledge, Tony Capullo. Thank you so much for introducing me to our guest today, who's got a tenured career from business logistics to finance and leadership and management in the healthcare space and financial technology space. And today, our guest, Nick Brignola, is the Chief Financial Officer of Informative, which Informative is providing credit or fraud credit compliance and infrastructure, payment infrastructure in the automotive and automotive dealerships to automotive dealerships and lenders. Nick, thank you so much for coming on the Culture Matters podcast. I'm excited to uh, learn, period. So, or exclamation mark. Thanks for
Yeah.
coming on the show.
No, I appreciate it, Jay, and really appreciate the opportunity today to talk with you. Um, Look, very interested in the Charlie Munger quote. I mean, I followed Charlie Munger as well as the whole Berkshire Hathaway story for a long time, and
Wow.
so Charlie. I mean, Charlie just passed within the last probably 18 months, I'm thinking. And so I'll be honest, I never heard that quote, but it is extremely factual. And we see that every day in terms of, in the business realm,
Hmm.
how we incentivize our people. You either, like results follow, right? And we see that specifically in a lot of times on the sales side, as well as just on the day-to-day business in terms of how people are ultimately trying to drive toward meeting their plans or meeting their forecast or ultimately meeting their bonus on an annualized basis. So how we incentivize people and also what we do from a what we permit or what we promote internally also impacts um, what ultimately we see from an outcomes and results perspective.
What percent in your career, what percentage of people really get that? Entrepreneurs, organizations really see that as, or is that something that comes in time?
So I think some of that. Look, there's certain functions within organizations that and I'm speaking specifically around the sales function, where look, they are going to do exactly what they are incentivized to do. So if a particular product is being um, incentivized or commissioned at a higher rate, well, typically you're going to see bookings or sales of those products certainly at a much higher level than something that's incentivized at a lower level. And so you've got to be very careful in terms of how you want to drive incentives within the organization. And look, I
Wow.
think any successful organization, as well as those that aren't so successful, a lot of it comes back to the point that you just made or the quote from Charlie Munger around incentives and results. Look, at the end of the day, most people, I say most people, but many people within an organization are, look, they want to do the right thing, right? But how they are incentivized, and people talk about it all the time, right? It is, it's February, and this company's on a December fiscal year, so we're a couple months into our year. I mean, it's mid March at this point, but we're closing our February books, and people are already talking about bonus, talking about commissions, talking about how we are performing, and certainly in finance, I'm always talking about that, but other areas of the organization too. So it is always top of mind for everybody. And how do we effectively drive growth? And that's got to be through some form of incentive.
I'm curious about this Charlie Warren piece for a second here. You got me super excited. You know about them, you've studied them,
Yep.
or what
Yep.
do you remember when you first came in contact with that culture?
Gosh, it's probably the whole Berkshire thing, it's got to be. I'm old, Jay, so I would
I
say,
thought you were Benjamin Button. What are we
yeah,
talking?
yeah, I'm definitely not. I would say, I first started to hear really and follow Berkshire in the late 90s. So
Wow.
we're
Oh,
talking
that's
about,
cool.
26, 27 years now. A guy that I worked with in one of my first roles actually decided that he was going to buy, and I can't remember, I think it was like Class B shares, I think are the cheaper ones.
Yeah.
And he bought a Class B share back in like 1998. Like
I
one
hope you're
share.
still friends.
Okay. Yeah. We bought one share at the time
That's
back in
exciting.
98. And then,
It's cool.
I mean, I've been in finance for a long time. And so, part of my daily routine is I get up, I get ready for the day, and I will turn on CNBC. And invariably, every year, CNBC is at the Berkshire annual meeting. They're talking to Buffett, they're talking to Munger, or they were, right? I mean, Buffett just retired,
Yeah.
right, and named his successor, and so I think, look, anybody in finance, um, I think watching what's gone on in the Berkshire world over the last, I'll call it, 60 years, and how Warren Buffett had managed that company, and nothing was flashy, but the businesses that they invested in were solid businesses, and it's always interesting. Charlie lived till he was in his late 90s, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah, 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 99.
Yeah, and I just think that those two guys, in terms of how they thought about business and how they thought about investing, like I always, any interviews on CNBC that they had, like I listened very acutely, because to me it's very important to try to learn how they operated, but also like how they thought about different things. And Buffett had he has his own quote about incentives, which I think was very interesting. And I don't know the exact quote, but he was asked how can we get a balanced budget in in Congress? And his quote was something to the effect of, if we incentivized the Congress on an annual basis to ensure that we had a balanced budget or within 3% of inflows or revenues, okay, tax revenues. If we incentivize Congress within plus or minus 3% by saying, look, you are going to be essentially voted out if you do not have a balanced budget, we'd have a balanced budget every year.
Mm.
So just going back to your quote about incentives and results, like I believe that. And we're just not, in many areas of right today, in many areas of the United States, especially when it comes to government, like the incentives are broken from my perspective. So, I find those two guys in Berkshire just it is a lesson in lesson in discipline about how they invested, a lesson in discipline around how they incentivized their organization in the businesses that they were looking to invest in, and it's been highly effective over time.
What was your early influence that led you studied business logistics? I found that's interesting.
Yeah, yeah, I did. So I'll be honest with you, Jay. I'm in my mid 50s now, but when I was going to college back in the late 80s, I was like, I probably was not mature enough to really um, like understand what I wanted to do in my career. And so I went to Penn State University. At the time, Penn State, I think they probably still do, or they're like Penn State's business logistics program was the top business
Wow.
logistics program in the country at the time. And so I thought, okay, I wasn't doing that well. I didn't do well in accounting. I didn't do well in finance either. Imagine I'm a CFO today, right? And those were courses that I did not do well in, and I just wasn't. My brain wasn't mature enough. It wasn't developed enough at the time to actually understand, many of the concepts. And so I went into business logistics. Had some great professors there, and long story short, I mean, I graduated with a logistics major, but I never really worked in logistics. I did some consulting work. Right after I graduated from college, I moved to Memphis, Tennessee. I worked in sales for about a year. Then I moved back to PA. I'm originally from PA, and moved back to Pennsylvania. And my father had a small consulting business, and I worked with him doing like occupational safety and health, loss control, and some transportation
Huh.
consulting and auditing. And so I did, I used my degree a little bit at that point, but honestly, I really got interested in some of the work that we were doing on the auditing side, and decided to start looking at grad schools. And long story short, I took the GMAT, and this was at the really the beginning of the internet. Okay, we're talking about 1994, 1995. Okay,
Yeah.
and and I went on the internet and researched, whether or not there were schools that had like an audit program, and found Louisiana State. And so called the professor, the guy who was the head of the internal audit program at LSU, and spoke to him for about 30 to 45 minutes, and decided like that's where I'm going to go. And and ironically, I bleed blue and white, right? I'm from Pennsylvania. I went to Penn State undergrad. I still, I'm a huge fan of Penn State, and I got accepted to Penn State for grad school for an MBA for both years, 96 and 97. And when I went to meet with one of the advisors at Penn State, they said, "Well, what other schools are you looking at?" And I said, "Well, I'm looking here, and I had a couple other schools, and I mentioned also LSU." And the guy laughed in my face.
Really?
Yeah, yeah. I said, "Well, this is interesting." Okay. And so at that, then I had the conversation with the professor, and long story, and I ended up going to LSU. And I will tell you this, Jay, that was probably the best decision, one of the best decisions that I ever made. My MBA at LSU cost me a grand total of, I think, $7,500. Okay,
Wow, that's
years.
amazing.
I was a GA for
And
three and
today,
four semesters, so I got in-state tuition, right? And the return on investment there, as well as some of the networking that I was able to do, and I went for internal audit, which again is a very unique type concentration, but
what is it?
internal audit. So I got an MBA with a concentration in internal auditing.
What does audit mean for our listeners that might just been triggered right now, like
Yeah,
in a
yeah,
way that
yeah.
might,
Great question. So there's two. I would say there's two general types of auditing that companies will do. One is external audit, which is, if you're a publicly traded company, and even many private companies who are owned by private equity or charities, right? Everybody, not everybody, but many companies will go through an audit. So they will, the external auditor will come in, and they will look at the financial books, okay, and they will determine whether or not there are controls in place to ensure that the accuracy and the integrity of the financials, okay, and then they will give an opinion on whether or not the controls are in place to ensure that the financials are appropriately stated, okay. That's external.
mm,
I didn't want to do that work. Okay, those there are some large companies in the United States that are that do audit work and advisory services. Companies like Price Waterhouse Coopers, Deloitte, KPMG. Those are large. They're part of the what's known as the Big Four accounting firms here in the U.S. Okay, I ultimately was doing internal audit work. And internal audit work typically is, for public companies here in the U.S. Typically, if you're a public company, you typically have to have an internal audit function. Okay, so you're looking at the risks internally. You're doing work, almost acting like an internal consultant, but also doing compliance-related work. So compliance with policies and procedures that the company has instituted,
Huh.
looking at how effective or efficient you are, okay, and providing insight and also recommendations back to management within particular functions or particular countries or what have you that may have subsidiaries. I was fortunate enough to graduate from LSU. I achieved a certified internal auditor certification or designation by the time I left LSU. And it's like having a CPA, but it's for internal auditors.
Huh.
There's four parts to the exam, something very similar to a CPA. Okay, and ultimately went to work for a pharmaceutical company, a company called Shearing Plow. They were in Jersey. So I moved from Baton Rouge back to the Northeast, and um, that really was my first foray into audit, like real professional, like from a corporate standpoint. Spent a couple years there, and then moved into finance, and the rest is history.
First, I want to ask, have you, what, where I was going to ask, was that, did you come into contact with the idea of culture then, or
Yeah,
at some
yeah,
point,
yeah,
like if you think because policy, procedure.
yeah,
So,
yeah. So I would say that you know I started learning about culture when I went to Shearing. Okay, and that was in 1998. And so, our culture, and it was ironic because while I was there, we were a very entrepreneurial company. Okay, and that to me is a culture. There's a culture there too. The company would make quick decisions, even though they were a publicly traded company. I
wow.
think when I joined Shearing, this is in 1998. I want to say from a market cap standpoint, they were a top 50 company in market cap. Okay.
Wow.
Now
And
they,
they were fast?
yeah, yeah, very, very fast about making decisions, right? They were just, that's the best word to describe as entrepreneurial. And over the next 2 or 3 years, though, the company had major issues. And they had major issues. I think some of that had to do with that. Okay. So, company had some quality issues. And when I say quality issues, um, over Christmas of 2000, Shearing had a number of plants in New Jersey. They had a number of plants in Puerto Rico. They had plants in Ireland. These were all favorable tax jurisdictions for pharmaceutical companies at one point in time or another. Okay,
Hmm.
so pharma companies would put their plants in a number of countries. Singapore was another one. Okay, where they had lower tax impacts, and in December of 2000, excuse me, Shearing had a product that was a albuterol inhaler. So for those who are asthmatic, right, quick acting inhaler, right, you're having an asthma attack, boom, you get hit with an albuterol inhaler, and you go back to some semblance of normal, right, from
Hmm.
an asthma attack. And they had a problem where there wasn't enough active ingredient in the product, and so they had to recall millions of inhalers. Okay,
Wow.
and so at the
Wow, that's scary.
yeah, at the time the FDA came in and they investigated, and ultimately the management team there, when the FDA came in and investigated, they gave what's known as a 583, which basically is like an issue. They were, the company was given like uh, a citation, I'll call it. Okay, they were given citations on the 583 form, and these were things that they had to fix. And the company did, at the time, really didn't take some of that seriously. Okay, and um, within probably 2 years, so company had a large product that was making a lot of money, but that product was about ready to go off patent, and the FDA delayed a subsequent product that was supposed to be a follow-on for a
Oh,
year.
wow.
They delayed approval for a year. And so the company went from making more than $1 billion in profit to negative, okay,
Wow.
loss in a year. And they had to, they were given at the time the largest fine in FDA history, a half a billion. Okay. They were under a consent decree. So there was all kinds of issues. But long story short around that, management team was disbanded, it was eliminated. A new management team was brought in. Okay, so the culture that Shearing had, to your point, Jay, right? Like it was very entrepreneurial, but it did not, there were guardrails that it did not stay within. Okay, and a
Interesting.
new management team came in, and that new management team really drove a culture around compliance and I'll say trust. We had a very simple mission with it when the new CEO came in, and it was earn trust every day. 3 words, but very powerful. And the organization really, from that point forward, they had to add a lot of people around compliance and those types of things. But culturally, the organization, was still entrepreneurial, but now within some guardrails. And probably 6 or 7 years into my stint there, I actually started working in a joint venture with Merck. Okay.
Wow.
And Merck, their culture was completely different. Okay. Merck was, we had this saying internally when I was at Shearing with some of I supported one of the marketing teams there. And, there was like the state school guys versus the private school guys. Merck was the private school guys. They were, guys from Penn and MIT and Harvard and Yale, and they were all data driven. Okay. Every decision had data. There was really not a lot of feeling at Merck. Okay. When you would walk through the halls at Merck, it was dead silent. Okay. It was silent. And
Really?
I would have to go to Merck and meet with my counterpart, and we would talk in his, like one of these cubicles with high walls. Okay. And he would tell me, like, you gotta be, you gotta be, what are you talking about? I mean, at Shearing, it was completely
Wow, that's
different.
fascinating.
Everybody was constantly communicating with each other. There was, guys didn't, there was not a whole lot of ego. Okay. And, culturally, the two companies were completely different,
Wow.
completely different, but they had a very successful joint venture, which ultimately led to Merck acquiring Shearing in 2009. And at that point, like I had a decision to make. Did I want to stay with Merck and be in that culture? Or did I want to leave the organization?
Mm.
And the reality is, to your question around culture, I, I couldn't live in that culture.
Wow.
I worked in that culture with those folks for 5 years. They were great people, but culturally, it just was not where, like, it wasn't what I wanted to do. And so, sometimes, we were very entrepreneurial at Shearing, and I wanted to go to something that was very similar to that. And Merck just wasn't that. Merck is just tried and true.
Mm.
Like, it was very, very structured. And I'm not necessarily that structured.
In your tenure, when you're engaging with these different ecosystems, and when you said policy, procedure, in your experience and wisdom, where's the in between or the balance of, because I'm
Yeah,
I'm thinking
this,
that it's
this
almost
is
like two extremes in that
yeah,
where
but this is what I would say, and this is, over. I've had a long career, Jay. Um, the way that I try to explain it to my teams and try to help, my finance and I have finance and accounting, and here I also have revenue operations that reports to me in informative. The way that I think about the culture, and the way that I think about, how do we operate on a day-to-day basis, like, my North Star is what is best for the business. Now, look, when you sit in a CFO chair, right, you've got a controlling a controllership type approach that you have to take, right? We have budgets and we have numbers we have to hit, and we have day to day that we need to support the business because we're a cost center, not a profit center. But what I tell my teams and try to help them engage with is like think about what's best for the business. Like imagine it's yours because it is. Okay. I treat every day being here or whatever business I work for as if it's mine. Okay. And if you think about what's best for the business, and that's your North Star and where your focus is, you'll actually make better decisions. And you'll think about things like risk management, like, oh, what's my liability potential here? Or, what kind of process, which is essentially a procedure, right? What kind of process do we want to put in place so it's well controlled, but also so it's not so strict that we are suffocating the business. Okay, and that's key.
I want to like try to integrate. You said imagine it's yours because it is. So like in that example of that company that provided the inhaler,
Yeah,
I'm thinking the inhaler, let's say it doesn't work. So that means somebody tries to use it. So I'm thinking of imagine it's yours because it is. If I'm maybe in marketing or sales or at
yeah,
the head of it, I'm thinking, oh yeah, imagine it's your inhaler. Do you want it to work? And maybe the incentives were, I don't know if you can elaborate on that thinking a bit more because it seems like
yeah,
a really powerful
yeah. So
mantra or word picture kind of thing.
yeah, in that for in that example specifically, what I would say is that we were focused, right? Public companies, okay, I'll be honest with you, like I don't want to ever go back to a public company, okay, because public companies are running on 90-day cycles, right? It is hard to meet investor estimates, what they think is going to happen with the business. They all got their own models, right? They're meeting with senior management all the time. They're on asking a lot of questions on investor calls, right? There's a quarterly release. Right? Like there's the long term thinking on how to build the business gets stifled
Hmm.
by the fact that every 90 days you're having to have you're releasing your results, and investment is hard. And so, and when I say investment is hard, it's hard to invest and meet your results over the long haul. I've been working private equity for, I had a short stint for a couple of years when I was at a company that was privately held by a private equity company, and we were bought and went public through that a couple of years ago. Okay, it's like 2022. But outside of the last 15 years, I've been basically with private equity backed companies. Okay, so outside of let's call it 2 years at that time, year and a half to 2 years, I've been with private equity backed. In private equity, like there's positives and negatives to that structure too. However, what I will say is that what is clear within the private equity realm is that dollars are invested in a company, okay, to acquire a company or recapitalize the company. And there's a long-term horizon. When I say long-term, it's typically 4 to 5 years, okay, where what the private equity group is doing is trying to effectively create value for themselves, but also create value for these shareholders, right? Where a lot of times the management team is part of that shareholder group. Okay.
So a distinction would be 4 to 5 years versus a quarter. Huge
Ex-
distinction.
Exactly.
I'm
Like you're
following,
making, yeah, you're
tracking
making the
your.
investments in the first couple of years that ultimately will pay off in years 4 and years 5, right? Or year 3 and 4 and 5. And in the public realm, it's just harder to do that because you can't, it's hard to make large investments that may ultimately have an outcome 3 years from now. Okay, now in the healthcare space and pharmaceuticals, well, they do that because they have R&D, right? So they're making R&D bets all the time. But the problem, if you want to invest in other areas, Okay, infrastructure within the business, your marketing team, right? Like
Mm.
G&A, you're not really investing a lot there because that's cost, right? You will invest in your sales team. You will do you will do the R&D work. But where we fell flat is we fell flat in our quality control, okay, at Shearing, and we fell flat in just the overall compliance aspect. And those were areas that needed to be beefed up. When the FDA came back and gave a $500 million fine, and the executive team was turned over, and when you start to think about like large publicly traded, let's call them Fortune 500 companies, you could go down the list. Think about the number of CEOs that are at a company for 5 years, right? There are some, right? You can think about the guys like that were companies for a long time. Jeff Bezos was at his company a long
Yeah.
time. Zuckerberg's at his company a long time. But you start to like get deeper down. It's like, hey, like you got guys that are there for 2-3 years, and what they're doing is they're doing, and ladies too. I don't mean to be sexist or anything. They're focused on 90-day increments. And
Mm.
that then pervades into the rest of the business, right? Because everybody's focused on, well, how's the quarter coming out? What's the quarter doing, right? Versus I gotta be thinking 12, 18, 24 months down the road at all times as an executive within an organization, because I'm not focused on today. Today's already passed. I have to
Mm.
focus on what's going to happen over the next 12 months, and what do I need to do over the next 12 months to grow this business or to ensure that we're going to be compliant. And it's a different mindset. It's just a completely different mindset. And the private equity groups, they are willing, some, not all, but many are willing to continue to invest, add on invest even after their initial investment within the organization, because they know that there is, potentially a return on investment that can be very significant for them in a very short period of time.
In your experience, have you seen any commonalities that have stood out? How the firms how they how they relate to their portfolio companies and vice versa? How that integration takes
Yeah,
place?
yeah. So many of the PE firms that I have worked with, and everybody's model is slightly different. Okay, but their end game is the same. So the models can be anywhere from, I've worked for, and I'll throw some names out, but Vista Equity Partners. Vista Equity, if you rolled up all of they're a software only private
Oh,
equity shop. Okay, Robert Smith is their
yeah,
chair.
brilliant guy.
Yeah,
I've
yeah,
watched interviews of
yeah,
him.
yeah, yeah, and they've got a group that, I mean, it's probably larger now, but back in 2018, 2019, if you had rolled up all of their portfolio companies, they would have been the fourth largest software company in the world. Okay,
Wow.
and so they had a group internally, uh, a consulting group called VCG, Vista Consulting Group, and they would come in and they would ultimately drive best practices into their businesses. Right?
Wow.
So they've got, at the time they probably had 70 portfolio companies, and so they were looking at best practices across all their businesses and helping to drive that in. A couple of the other companies, PE firms that I have worked for, they were large. I worked for another large one that was out of New York as well. They didn't necessarily have any of this consulting type stuff. They had operating partners, and so they had a finance operating partner or an operations operating partner. So they had experienced people who were essentially sitting next to you, not physically, but working with you on different projects or different things to make the business better. Okay,
Fascinating.
and then I had uh,
Wow.
the PE firm I'm with now. They have a group that essentially, I would say, sort of is like a hybrid approach to the two that I just mentioned. So it's like an internal consulting organization, uh, but it is Like they're not coming in to the office. Okay. Like Vista was on site. Those guys were on site. Okay. These guys are more, hey, this is the playbook we want to run, right? And you're level one now, and we want to get you to a level five. Okay. So it's extremely interesting that they all sort of operate differently, but the end game is the same.
So like one had like a buddy model in the sense, but it was a bit mentor-mentee dichotomy, but almost like
Yeah.
peer level. Another is like consigliere or Aristotle to Alexander the Great or something. And then the one was you said like they were there. So what I don't have a good analogy on top of my head, I don't think. Um maybe it'll come to me. This is fascinating. I one thing I'm very curious about is what is going on in the automotive space that what is going on in the automotive space that you see value or disruption or opportunity
Yeah.
that our automotive dealership groups that listen to the show and families and their third party partners should be thinking about that they might not be.
Yeah. Yeah. What's happening in the automotive space is very interesting. So this is my second uh, stint with a software company where its focus is on the automotive space. Okay. And we're a little bit different. Whereas we provide we provide credit services. Okay, so when you go to the dealership, right, somebody's going to pull your credit. They might do a soft pull, they might do a hard pull, right? The soft pull doesn't affect your credit, but the hard pull does, right? In terms of that, but we also provide compliance. Okay, so when you walk into a dealership, imagine we're going to buy a car, Jay, right?
Yeah.
There's more than 100 federal regs that you need to comply with as a dealership. Okay, so I don't know if you've bought a car recently. I bought one 6 or 7 weeks ago.
We bought one for one of my moms,
Okay, okay, great.
actually.
So when you walk in, even before you walk in, right, you can go online and get a pre-approval, right, from the dealership. Okay, and so um, they're taking your information, right, your personal information, all right, and when I like I was pre-approved before I even walked in, right? I was pre-approved. They met me at the door because I called them up and said, "Look, I
Huh.
I actually do like the whole process of being in a dealer, like I really don't like." Okay, and I've bought 13 cars in the last 9 years. Okay, so I'm like a hyper buyer. I'm
Seems like
not
a lot of
allowed. My,
yeah.
my wife will not allow me to go to Best Buy or a dealership by myself. Okay, because I took a car into the dealer to get an oil change. Okay, and I came home with a new car. I was like, forget that. I don't even want to pay for the oil change. I'll just buy another car. Okay, so this is what happened in this case 2 months ago, 6 weeks ago, whatever it was. As soon as you walk in now, though, right, they ask you for your driver's license, right? And they take a picture of it, many of them. Okay. Well, look, there's dealers today that the guys are taking pictures of your driver's license on their personal phones. Okay. And so now your information is sitting on somebody's personal phone. Our product actually, in essence, walks through all the compliance from the initial lead, okay, when you walk through the door, all the way to the sale process or right before the lender process. So everything that you need to comply with as a dealership, you're able to do all of that through our platform. And also, at the end of the day, a lot of the risk is not with you, the buyer. There's fraud risk around some of that, right? I mean, somebody coming in that is fraudulent, right? They might have Jay Doran's driver's license and information, but it's not Jay,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And that's, man, there's a huge impact for them. They're selling a vehicle to a fraudster. Okay, so there's a loss associated with that, but it's around what you would call dead deals, right? So you walk in and you look, but you don't buy. Okay, now all your personal information is already there. So what happens to that information? So it's no different than if you're your personal information is sitting with anybody, your healthcare provider. It doesn't matter, right? It's sitting there. And so
Hmm.
many, we still have dealerships in the United States where, and there's many of them, where their deal jacket, which essentially is all the information about you, okay,
Okay.
and in the deal that they were trying to structure, right, your payment and all that other stuff, is sitting in a folder somewhere, okay, within the dealership, and it might be in one of those Iron Mountain boxes, okay, right, one of those file boxes, and like that information is ripe for fraud, okay, and so our products that we have actually enable um, the compliance around all of it. It's all encrypted. It's all they can and there's no timeline. Like that information, the dead deals as well as all the deals that actually went through. Like we're saving all that information on because there can be an audit from the government at any time for the deal.
I'm okay. I'm curious about if we have a binary of like, there's two listeners right now that are, let's say, dealer side. One is, wow, yeah, I'd be embarrassed if that was happening in my dealership because I'm proud of the customer journey.
Yeah,
Another would be like, well, I don't care. Why should I care? I'm curious if you could speak to both of those avatars.
yeah, yeah. I
Why
mean,
is this valuable?
look, it really becomes a compliance issue as well as like your personal information, Jay, okay, or my personal information may get into the wrong hands, and now I got an issue, and I'm going to come back against you, right? It's like,
Come
hey,
back against the dealership, you're
hey,
saying.
come back against the dealer, right? Because if my data is not secured, my data is not secured, right? Somebody gets a hold of my data, okay? You got my driver's license, okay? They might have my other information that was in that deal jacket, okay? And they use that to open up a card or they use that to go get a mortgage. They use that, right? Whatever. Well, look, at the end of the day, it's going to come back on my credit, right? And I'm going to say, well, I didn't buy it. I didn't buy a house.
Are there any, or could there be any class action lawsuits against like massive dealer groups that this happens in? I'm
You
thinking
know,
because you mentioned Buffett earlier.
yeah.
There's one that they bought a bunch of years ago with like not like 100 dealers. It's a
Oh,
large.
it's a Berkshire. Yeah, Berkshire's got about 100
They
dealers
have a
in the U.S.
huge dealer.
Yeah,
It was a
yeah.
family thing.
There's one right down the street, literally right down the street from where I am right now.
Like,
They are a huge dealership. They're one of the largest in the United States.
and I want that because that's a culture thing. Because I was just reading the Edward Gibbons Fall of Rome. Like, there's a four book. I mean, I'm like page 50. Okay, so everybody calm down. But it basically, 50, it decayed from the inside. So on the
Yes.
fringe, if they have 100 dealerships and 10 of them or two of them, it's like falling. This is happening. So I'm curious about, are there any laws like is there the class action, or like could customers come together and go against a dealer, or what are the actual ways it would come back to a dealership? I'd be curious about that.
I think part of I'm not aware of any class actions, but I've been in this new space only since early January, right? So I mean, my focus is not, you know, I haven't heard of any of our customers having any, but that doesn't mean that there can't be. Okay, and so if you're negligent, in terms of, like as part of our demo process, like we actually have pictures of like a back door with just file boxes, right, of folders, which are all
Wow.
dead deals, right, that somebody could walk out, walk in, take 10 folders with them, we'll just walk out. You never know, right? So, from a dealership perspective, look, compliance costs money, right? I mean, compliance is not free for anybody. However, you got to think about, well, what's the real liability here, right? The real liability is much greater. And when you walk in the door, as I said, there's over 100 regs that from the federal government that the dealership needs to comply with. And these types of solutions enable consistency, right? You know exactly step by step what's going to happen and also ensure that you're in compliance with all the federal regs. That's the point.
But how does it actually, so what's the process? And the reason I'm asking that is I'm thinking I want, if you said something about with a salesperson having something on their phone, right? So
Mhm.
like that makes me think about attention and where intentions are, and the customer journey, because the
Yeah.
culture is right, the customer journey, and like, are we serving them, and how are we serving them? Where's our attention? So then it makes me think of core values and like, so I'm just curious about that piece of the conversation. I guess the question in that is, what's the process exactly for, let's say, someone wants to take care of this and partner and go through that.
Yeah,
What does
yeah. I
that
mean,
look like?
from our perspective, look, I mean, and we're not the only ones, but we are. It's sort of an end-to-end um, solution for dealerships, and also we have non-auto customers as well on the mortgage side of the house. But ultimately, what this product does, or from a customer journey standpoint, look, when I walk into a when I walked into the dealership, they immediately said, "Hey, can we have your driver's license?" The guy takes a picture. Right now, I asked him, right? I said, what do you guys use?
Oh,
And he's like, and he told me the name of the product they used. Okay, and we work with a number of other, I would call, integrated systems. Okay, so you can have us by itself, but not by itself. Like, we're integrated with the dealer management systems. Okay, but there's also some CRMs, because, well, your information will go into a customer resource management program as well, right? Because if you end up buying, or maybe you don't, uh, the dealership may reach back out to you, right, and say, hey, Jay, you didn't buy, but we're running a
yes,
personal check.
that's what I was trying to ask is how do you actually protect it? So,
Yeah.
so yeah,
So they're protected in some form or fashion in the CRMs, which are attached to the dealer management systems, right? And those should have security around them, okay? And our product has security around it, right? So especially when you talk about PII, right? It's personal information, that you want to make sure that all that information, especially as it relates to credit, right? Your social security number and credit and that type of stuff, like, I had this conversation with somebody the other day about PII, okay, personal information. And I was, we had this conversation. I said, look, like, I don't like my personal information's out there. Okay, for anybody to think that it's not, okay, is really like not understanding what's going on, right? 2 years ago, Change Healthcare. I don't know if you know who they are. Change Healthcare. They're part of United Healthcare. Okay, they're a clearinghouse
mm,
for claims. Okay, for insurance claims. Well, Change was hackers broke into Change and stole. I can't remember how much data, 6 terabytes, something to that effect of patient data. Well, Change has 9 out of 10 Americans, their data is 9 out of 10 Americans are in the Change data, right? And so
wow.
6 months later, 6 months later, I got a letter in the mail from Change. Hey, by the way, we had a data breach 6 months ago. Okay, and if you want, you can go to Experian for $9.99. We'll pay for a year's worth of service, right? I from I bet you I have gotten 10 more since then. AT&T's got a breach, and TJ Maxx has got a breach. I mean, all these breaches, right? So when we talk about PII, like, that's important, uh, but at the same time, I think our information is out there, right? So I don't get that jazzed up about it, but we are a highly secure service. But we had one of our competitors in the space actually had a breach probably 60 days ago. Okay, a credit breach, right? They were a credit
Mm.
provider and they had a breach, right? So it happens. And by the way, like, if you're large enough, you get pinged every day with somebody trying to get in, right? Like, data is dollars at this point, right? And it's probably not even dollars; it's more Bitcoin. Okay, I mean, all these guys, all these hackers, all want Bitcoin in terms of the ransomware that
Mm.
comes in. So it is important for these dealership groups, and there's about 17,000 franchise dealers in the United States,
Really?
a lot more independents. Okay, but it's important for them, right? It's very important for them to have in place some form of compliance services. right? And
If they don't, then what happens to them though?
well, if they don't, then there's a possibility that they're not going to, if they get an audit, okay, if there's an audit that happens, they could be fined. So, and I don't know how much the fines are, to
All
be
right,
honest with you,
I
Jay,
want to
but
make sure I'm following this. So essentially, from the the probability of our stuff being shared is extremely high as people, as consumers. However, the bare minimum, or yeah. However, with that, we have to have our compliance in order because
yeah,
because it's going to ultimately the organization will be the one ultimately responsible. So it just seems like a lose for consumers across the board and a double lose for organizations because if you don't have that, then you're responsible. But then that makes me think about I want your opinion on this from your experience, culture wise and leadership wise, management is let's say that an organization like yeah, dealer group, they are compliant, right?
yeah,
Then then uh, they also have to have a way of serving customers and working with one another to make sure someone doesn't leave a file in the middle of a. And to me, that brings up a culture and leadership conversation. And this is what I want your thoughts on is that my opinion is that, or like my guess would be somebody that is taking the compliance seriously, that's having the proactive conversations with a third party is probably thinking about how their people are behaving at work. And someone that's not willing to have the conversation is probably got their head in the sand or they're focused on the wrong things. That's my opinion, but I'm curious about your thoughts on that or
yeah. I think the most, I think, many organizations out there, over probably the last, I'm going to say, and I can only speak for my career, the last 30, 40 years, right, all have, core values, right? And those core values, people are being measured. So going back to your incentives, like the first thing that we talked about,
yeah.
people are measured within organizations on the core values, right? So, how are you exhibiting those values throughout the year? Where do when you go through your performance review, okay, there are questions about the core values and not just, oh, did you exhibit it? No, how did this individual exhibit it, right? For the manager or for the executive that's doing somebody's review, right? But from my perspective, like you're either talking about this all the time, or it's just a piece of paper on a wall, right? Like you've got to live and breathe what those values are on a day-to-day basis.
Mm,
And those the organizations that are successful, like I will tell you that in my experience, the organizations that are highly successful are those that take that stuff seriously. Okay, and that it's pervasive, right? And the when you think about culture, right, like typically culture starts at the top. Right? It starts at the CEO level, and it gets pushed down to the rest of the organization. And it's important that the CEO takes those things seriously. Not that we're just writing something up and it's like, yeah, these are our values, right? And we go through them one time and that's it. Like those organizations that are successful and that are growing, like if you listen to those CEOs, it's very interesting. I watch a lot of interviews on CNBC with very successful CEOs. Like they are not, to a T, they are even keeled. You don't see, high levels of excitement. You don't see like they're very even keeled. They're focused on there's this whole thing, around signal and noise. They're focused on signal, right? Like, what do we need to achieve? And I've been a part of, a few organizations
mm,
where when you go to work every day, it doesn't feel like you're working because the whole organization is rowing in the same direction.
mm,
Everybody understands culturally, what we're trying to achieve, but also the behaviors of everybody are very similar. And when I say the behaviors are similar, it is, you know, the businesses that I've been a part of that have been most successful, people were open, people were transparent. Okay, people are not, honestly, like checking their ego at the door. Okay, that it sounds like it's just, does that really happen? Yes, yes, it happens, right? And people, to me, Jay, the most successful organizations, everybody in that organization understands how they fit into what that organization's values are, but also what that organization is trying to achieve.
Mm.
And there are some people that are able to, some leaders that are able to really effectively um, manage and bring the team along with them. And there's others, and I'm talking about the same organization now. There's others where you can see that something's just not connecting. And when something's not connecting, those areas of the organization suffer.
I can't wait. You got to come back to the show already. What a great
Anytime.
what a great time. I have so many takeaways. I do want for our audience, Nick Brignola, Chief Financial Officer of Informative. How can people get in touch with yourself, the organization that are listening?
Sure. I mean, I have a LinkedIn profile out there under, at Informative. Um, I mean, look, I'm pretty open. I'm more than happy to provide Jay with Jay. I can give you my information in terms of like. I'll tell you personally, I am really not. You probably haven't had somebody on that said this, but I do not read personal email. Okay, and you had mentioned Tony earlier in the show. Tony will send me an email and follow up with a text. Hey, I sent you an email because I will not read personal emails. I have a petty little goal for myself to get to 1 million unread emails. Okay, and I'm closing in. I'm about 900,000 unread
Wow,
emails at this
interesting.
point.
That could be
Um,
like a movie to like go through a documentary.
well, I had a goal of Google at some point saying that they had to add nodes on their on like an investor call because Nick Brignola had so many unread emails. But Google Google now charges me because there's only so much space. For years it was all free, but it's not free anymore. They only give you so many gigs of space for your email, and I've hit that in two separate emails. And Yahoo the same thing. So long story short, look, you can reach out to me via text. I'm more than happy to talk to anybody. I'll give Jay. I'll give you my number offline, and you're more than happy to hand it out to whoever. But those are probably the easiest ways to get in touch with me. Call me, send me a text message, or link into me, and I'm more than happy to link into to anyone.
Nick, I'm so excited to have you on the show. What an amazing episode, and you're welcome back anytime. If you're listening to this episode, please share this with someone that needs to think about compliance in a different way, I think, because that word generally, at least before this episode, makes me think snooze fest. But this is I'm awake. I'm I'm excited.
Good.
Oh yeah, I've never been this excited about compliance and leadership in this way. So I have so many thoughts. Please leave us a review on the Culture Matters podcast, and we will see you next time. Thank you, my friend.